Hello and welcome to the first installment of what will be a several-part series about the history of video games. In these videos, I'll explore what shaped the video game industry into the massive success it has become today. Through the highs and lows of it, the history of video games shaped up to be one of the most intriguing and reputable series of events in recent history, so stick around and we'll get started. Video games can be traced as far back as 1947, with a piece of technology known as the cathode ray tube amusement device. It was created by Thomas T. Goldsmith Jr. and Essel Ray Mann. The device was a missile simulator that utilized control knobs. The goal of the game was to control a CRT beam and a targeted dot on the screen. A patent was issued for the device in 1948, despite the fact that this device was never sold or marketed. Though throughout the following years more interactive electronics were developed, such as tic-tac-toe in 1951 and tennis for two in 1958 at MIT, in 1961, a group of a few students at MIT conceived Spacewar, which to many is considered to be the first actual video game. Steve Russell, one of the students credited for conceiving the game, coded the initial version of the game for a PDP-1 computer. Today, there is only one known PDP-1 computer that is still functional. The game Spacewar was a two-player game that was sort of a precursor to games like Asteroids, which oddly enough debuted almost 20 years later. The game had a central gravitational pull that would pull players into the sun. The object of the game was to shoot your opponent before they shot you. Last man standing was the winner. Spacewar was certainly advanced for its time, but due to the fact that it had to be run on a PDP-1 computer, the game was therefore not profitable, at least not at that point in time. Throughout the remainder of the 60s, the game Spacewar was reprogrammed several times and released variously on other computer systems. By 1966, it was decided that the best way to play Spacewar would be to build a computer unit that could hook up to a television monitor. By the end of the 1960s, Spacewar had been field tested by consumers, and it was at this point in time that development of Spacewar for a larger audience began. The game Spacewar was revitalized in the early 1970s due to the several advancements in computer technology. In 1971, Spacewar was successfully ported to what is now known as the very first coin-operated video game machine. It was renamed the Galaxy game for the release, and the machine was placed at Stanford University due to the belief that it was a niche product that only college students would enjoy. The hardware for the machine costed roughly $20,000 US, which would equate to more than $100,000 US today. Meanwhile, Bill Nutting, the founder of Nutting Associates, saw the potential of the coin-operated video game machine and hired Nolan Bushnell, a man who had the idea of putting Spacewar into its own unit, and Ted Dabney to design a version of Spacewar. They developed a smaller version of the game and placed it inside of a fiberglass shell with the controls. By November of 1971, the unit was ready for release, the first widely distributed coin-operated video game machine. Nutting Associates had very little success in moving the unit, though. It is estimated and speculated that of the original 1,500 unit production run, only 500 to 1,000 units were moved. Nolan Bushnell still saw the potential of the coin-operated video game despite the flop of the Computer Space, so he approached Bill Nutting and asked if he could develop a sequel to Computer Space. In return, he asked for an ownership stake in the company. Bill Nutting refused the offer, and Nolan Bushnell left Nutting Associates. Nolan Bushnell would form Atari a year later. Let's switch gears now and look into another important event in video game history that occurred less than a year after the introduction of the coin-operated video game machine. That is, the development and release of the Magnavox Odyssey in late 1972. The Odyssey is the first home video game console. Ralph Baer, the creator of the system, had been working on the project for years. In 1968, he had a prototype of the Odyssey called the Brown Box unit. Magnavox saw the potential of this unit and bought the rights to it. The console sold poorly upon its initial release due to the bad marketing and the consumer misconception that the console would only work on Magnavox television sets, which was definitely not the case. The system was simplistic for its time, but it was groundbreaking in the respect that it was the very first home video game console ever. Though it was never really revered for its power, the Magnavox Odyssey had a large library of games that included the likes of tennis, Simon Says, and baseball. The console came bundled with overlays that were to be placed over a television screen to simulate graphics. Though laughable by today's standards, the Odyssey is remembered as the grandfather of home console gaming. Magnavox saw the sale of roughly 300,000 Odyssey units, which at the time was a somewhat successful release. As I stated earlier, after Nolan Bushnell left Nutting Associates, he went on to form Atari Inc., a name that would become synonymous with video games for the remainder of the decade. Bushnell got Ted Dabney to help him create the company in early 1972. As Atari was formed, Bushnell hired Al Alcorn as the company's first design engineer. Bushnell, who had seen the game Tennis on the Magnavox Odyssey, challenged Alcorn to make a version of the game for the arcades. I think everyone already knows what became of this endeavor. Pong was born. Though the release of Pong's prototype predated the release of the Magnavox Odyssey, the idea for Pong was actually conceived by Bushnell in the summer of 1972 after he had seen a demonstration of tennis on the Magnavox Odyssey at a summer electronics show. The arcade machine prototype for Pong was completed by September of 1972 and installed in a bar called Andy Capp's Tavern. The game was an initial hit with patrons of the bar. Soon the bar became flooded with people just simply getting in to play the game. Seeing the success of their Pong machine, Atari decided they would be more profitable if they manufactured the game rather than licensing it, despite large offers from Midway and Bally. On November 29, 1972, Atari announced that they would release Pong for a larger audience after having received a line of credit in order to open up an assembly line for the machines. In 1973, the machines were released and the nation was swept away by the Pong phenomenon. Pong, which had been a simple training exercise for a new employee, had become the biggest video game of all time. The simplistic controls of the game brought the casual audience into the foray of video games. By the end of 1974, after the massive success of its Pong games, Atari Inc. began to consider a home version of Pong after an employee suggested that they make a unit in the same vein as the Magnavox Odyssey that could hook up to a TV set. Bushnell liked the idea and challenged both Al Alcorn and Harold Lee, who had originally suggested the idea, to build a prototype of his vision. They completed a prototype by early 1975 and test marketed it, but failed to get consumer commitment to the product due to its price point. Atari approached several toy companies to sell the unit. Most retailers refused the offer due to the dismal sales of the Magnavox Odyssey. A representative of Sears named Tom Quinn was one of very few who expressed interest in retailing the Pong unit. Bushnell pitched the idea that Atari could produce 75,000 units for the holiday season of 1975. Tom Quinn, on the other hand, requested twice the amount at 150,000 units. Though Atari had to acquire a new factory in order to meet Sears' order, they managed to produce 150,000 units for the holiday season. In 1976, the popularity of the home Pong console grew considerably, with several iterations and versions being released and sold by different companies. Atari had given birth to not only the arcade gaming market with Pong machines, but also the home video game market with home Pong consoles after the Magnavox Odyssey failed to grasp consumers at the beginning of the 1970s. The 1970s saw the birth of arcade machines with computer space and home consoles with the Magnavox Odyssey. The audience for video games was established and grew considerably after the success of Atari's Pong machines. This all set up the next generation of both home gaming and arcade gaming, and the massive success it spawned going into the 1980s. So please stay tuned for part 2 of the history of video games.